As fears grow that the conflict in Gaza could widen to neighboring states, there has already been a spillover effect, but in Europe. Several governments have led crackdowns on Muslim groups and institutions in what officials claim is an attempt to fight the spread of anti-Semitism. In Germany, police raided 54 sites, including an Islamic center, over its alleged ties to Iran and Hezbollah. Officials said they were targeting extremists and not a religion. German authorities have also banned many pro-Palestinian demonstrations, saying they are trying to curb public discrimination against Jewish people. But pro-Palestinian groups say the move has only restricted Muslims from expressing their support for Gaza. Meanwhile, in France, a mosque recently received a letter threatening the country's Muslim community. Other hate crimes, including anti-Muslim graffiti and vandalism, have been seen on mosques, cemeteries and businesses. The rise in Islamophobia, which was already underway before the Gaza war broke out, has many fearing that hate groups will capitalize on the divisions caused by the conflict to further target Muslims in Europe. The rise in Islamophobia, which was already underway before the war in Gaza broke out, has many fearing that hate groups will capitalize on the divisions caused by the conflict to further target Muslims in Europe. And now to talk about the rise of Islamophobia in Europe amid Israel's war on Gaza. Joining me from Amsterdam is Jan Roth. He is a professor of urban sociology at the University of Amsterdam. And from Paris, Hanan Mohammed. He is a member at Les Musulmans Association. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Jan, how has Israel's war against Hamas and its attack on civilians added to the already rising tide of Islamophobia across Europe?
Oh, enormously. It served as an accelerator of all sort of sentiments at both ends. So we observe today a steep rise in anti-Semitism, but we also see a steep rise in Islamophobia. And people from different communities, they respond to each other, and it only contributes to heating up the confrontation. I think it's important to understand that the war that Israel is waging against Hamas at the moment is an accelerator, but before the start of this war, there were all sorts of sentiments that were heating up time and again. And this is related to sort of historical resentments. It's related to sort of the cultural opinions that people have brought from their home countries. It's related to the very lousy position in which many Muslims, and Muslims in Europe tend to be first or second or third generation immigrants, the position in which they find themselves, which is quite substandard. And they accuse the politicians, the media, of having a double standard. And that is quite understandable.
So, Hannah, what do you think? Will there be some political fallout for governments who have been fully supportive of Israel's attack on Gaza? I mean, how do you read the public reaction in several European countries?
I think it will depend on the countries. If we look at the recent events in the UK, we've seen that the protests managed to shift the government towards like a more nuanced approach. Even though they haven't called for a ceasefire, we see that they have changed the government. However, especially for the interior minister, however, for France, we have seen, as my colleague just explained, the narrative that has been built by Israel since October 7th was about a terrorist Islamist attack. And this called on a lot of emotions in France regarding the recent events in 2015, as you may recall, Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan. So they're saying, like, look at, these are the same. These are, if you do not help us, they will be at your gate. So we see that the political parties, the whole, let's say, political parties in France are all, let's say, behind these narratives. Now, being fully supportive of Israel, to answer your question, in France, it was strategically and structurally, unfortunately, the case for France. They have some strategic interests. So we're trying to move. We have some parties that are supporting on the left side. the Palestinian struggle. However, we have seen, which is something I was about to say funny, but maybe more scary than funny, that even now the far right, on top of Macron's government and all the other parties, are converging in the anti-Semitism. So we're not seeing a lot of, let's say, leverage from the Muslims and the pro-Palestinian today in France as we see in the UK.
So, Jan, why have authorities in various European countries imposed excessive restrictions on pro-Palestinian rallies since October 7th? I mean, what are they afraid of?
Well, there are many aspects. One is that the government, as my colleague has just explained, hasn't been very consistent in their position with regard to Israel or Hamas. And I'm from the Netherlands. The Prime Minister here initially explained that we will totally support Israel. But in the course of time, we noticed that that position has become much more nuanced. And there is today sort of the mood is more that Israel is overreacting and at the expense of women and children and other innocent people, and that is something that really triggers a lot of people. At the same time, there is concern that all European countries are looking at each other, but they're also looking at the US. Let's not forget the position of the United States. It's the most influential country when it comes to Israel. And the current president of the US is very reluctant to be more critical than he now is against Israel. Keep in mind, the election's coming up, so he needs to operate on a very thin line, and that makes it very, very difficult. And this is happening in a situation where there is a government in Israel that sort of before the attack of October 7 was seen internationally, but also nationally, as a very extremist government with anti-Muslim leaders as ministers who have always thought in very radical solutions. And suddenly we don't hear that anymore. It's sort of, it dropped out of space as if that's still not relevant. I think it's still relevant.
So, Hannah,
not so much.
So, Hannah, is Europe choosing its support for Israel over its core values of freedom of expression, which it has championed for decades?
It has indeed championed that narrative for decades now, and it's even in the roots of, let's say, the political space in France historically. However, and to emphasize what my colleague just said, I believe at the official reasons, and at the beginning, it's, let's say, legitimate to have some time to mourn the victims of October 7th. So this was a legitimate, let's say, time to mourn, right? And it was not appropriate, maybe, at the very beginning to protest. That's, maybe we can agree on that. However, then, of course, Macron has, let's say, highlighted or very, very quickly his steadfast support to Israel and unconditional support. So now the double standards we were referring to now appears. On the one side, we're championing where the human rights, let's say, defenders France, I mean, and always, and they showed that during the war in Iraq, right? Because we're at the time where Jacques Chirac and Dominique de Villepin stand against, let's say, some, let's say, neutral stance for Iraq. Now it's not the case, and let's say the political analysts saying that now France has not, let's say, the same cards at play also. They have, in the Africa, as you have seen, even in the Middle East, they have lost a lot of ground. They don't have the same influence now to shift from the narrative of the US and Israel. So they need to have, let's say, to stay balanced. On the one side, to support Israel and the US for strategic interest, and on the other side, to try to, let's say, give some space also to their partners, Arabs, and also intern politics. But this is more a balanced game neutral.
So it also seems that Emmanuel Macron could risk losing the next elections to far-right leaders. But Jan, as Hannah mentioned, like the French president has been lately calling on a ceasefire. And just recently, Britain's Home Secretary Braverman, who drew anger from accusing police of being too lenient on pro-Palestine protesters, was sacked by the British Prime Minister. So the question is, like, have some European leaders reached a point that unwaveringly defending Israel has become a liability for them?
Well, in a certain way it is. I mean, I can't understand why people are still defending a country that, of course, has the right to retaliate against a terrorist organization, but at the same time does it in a way that's so over the top. And you can't defend that. And you can't say, we can't talk about it, because that's not how Europeans are. With free countries, you can talk about each and any topic. And now a substantial part of the population, and keep in mind, we're not talking just about Muslims. Also non-Muslims in various European countries, they speak out. And because they argue, this is inappropriate, we need to do something. What makes things very difficult is that in discourse, there is a confusion between anti-Israeli opinions and anti-Jewish opinions. And the latter is inappropriate. I mean, that's out of the question. But many people, in the way they talk, in the way they have been talking about Israel for a very long time, they confuse that. And that makes it very, very difficult to handle. Partly because some of these sort of comments, they become, outspoken anti-Semitic. And if that trajectory is followed, it's sort of, it offers the governments an excuse to say, we don't want to hear that, we don't want you to talk about it anyway.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.